Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep into comparative politics.
Ooh.
I know it doesn't sound the most
No.
thrilling topic, but trust me, this is going to be a good one. We're not just going to be, throwing around facts and figures about
Yeah.
different political systems around the world.
Right.
This deep dive is about getting a deeper understanding of how those systems actually work.
Absolutely.
Why are they the way they are?
Yeah.
And how are they changing
Mm.
in our increasingly complex world?
Yeah. And that's what makes this so relevant now,
Right.
especially with, globalization and all its complexities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to help us unpack all of this, we're going to be looking at a really fascinating article by Philippe Schmitter,
Yes.
who's a leading scholar in the field.
Leading scholar.
And he basically argues that the old way of studying politics, comparing countries like these isolated islands,
Right.
it just doesn't work anymore.
It doesn't cut it. The world is far more interconnected than that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty,
Mm-hmm.
let's take a step back. For anyone who might not be super familiar with this field, what exactly is comparative politics? What are we even talking about here?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. Comparative politics at its core is about looking at different political systems around the world and figuring out why they are the way they are. Why are some countries democracies while others are authoritarian? Why do some countries have strong welfare states while others have, more limited social safety nets? It's about finding the patterns, the underlying reasons behind these similarities and differences.
So it's not just about, memorizing all these facts and figures about different
Yeah.
countries. It's about understanding the why behind all those facts.
Precisely. And to understand how this field has evolved, Schmitter uses this really intriguing metaphor of a family tree.
A family tree. I love that. It's a great way to visualize
Yeah.
the evolution of ideas.
Yeah.
So what are these branches?
Well, he traces the roots of comparative politics back to two main branches. One branch is what he calls sociological constitutionalism. Thinkers in this tradition, like Aristotle, Tocqueville, Weber, they were all concerned with how societies and their political systems kind of interact and influence each other. For instance, Tocqueville was fascinated by how American democracy was shaped by its unique social conditions.
So it's about understanding how the fabric of society, like the culture,
Mm-hmm.
the values, the social structures, influence the way its politics work.
Exactly. And the other branch is legal constitutionalism, which focuses on the formal written rules and institutions of government constitutions, laws, electoral systems. Scholars in this tradition are interested in how these rules shape political behavior. For example, how does a country's electoral system, say a proportional system versus a winner-take-all system, affect the number of political parties and their behavior?
So we have these two foundational branches,
Mhm.
one looking at the social and cultural side of politics,
Right.
the other at the formal rules and institutions.
Mm.
And it makes sense that you kind of need both of those to understand how political systems actually operate.
Absolutely. And over time, comparative politics has drawn on insights from other disciplines too, psychology, anthropology, and especially economics.
Oh, interesting.
So it's a pretty rich
Okay.
and multifaceted field.
Yeah, so that's fascinating. Where does this leave us today? Where does this leave comparative politics today?
Well, Schmitter argues that the field is at a crossroads. He sees three possible paths forward. And understanding these paths is key to understanding his argument.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these paths.
All right, so the first path is what we might call sticking with tradition. It's essentially about continuing to focus on those two main branches we talked about, sociological and legal constitutionalism, with a focus on comparing institutions across countries.
Okay, so sticking with what we know, the tried and tested methods.
Mm-hmm. What's the second path?
What's the second path?
The second path is simplification. And this one draws heavily on economics and rational choice theory. It attempts to explain political behavior by assuming that individuals are rational actors who make decisions to maximize their self-interest.
So it's about reducing complex political phenomena
Right.
down to individual self-interested calculations.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And the third path, the one that Schmitter advocates for, is what he calls complexification. He argues that the world is becoming increasingly complex and interconnected.
Which makes those simplified models less and less accurate.
Exactly. Sticking with the traditional institutional approaches or overly simplifying things just won't cut it anymore. We need a new approach that can grapple with this complexity.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going.
Yeah.
So Schmitter's making the case for a more nuanced and sophisticated way of looking at politics.
Mm-hmm.
Why does he think this complexification is so important? Like, what's driving this need?
He points to two major trends that make this complexification so crucial. The first is that individual countries are themselves becoming more complex internally.
Okay, what does that mean exactly?
Well, we used to think of countries as these homogenous units, but that's not really the case anymore. Power is becoming more dispersed across different levels of government, national, regional, local unit. Think about the rise of powerful regional governments in countries like Spain or Italy. There's also a growing number of interest groups, social movements, and NGOs, all vying for influence.
So it's like a multi-layered cake
Yeah.
with all these different actors
Mm-hmm.
and levels of power at play.
Precisely. And this brings us to the second trend, increasing interdependence between countries. Globalization is blurring the lines between countries in a way that makes studying them in isolation impossible.
Yeah, it's true. We're all connected now more than ever.
Yeah.
Think about the European Union or the impact of the global financial markets. What happens in one country can ripple across the
You
globe.
got it. Decisions made in one part of the world can have unintended consequences in another. And this combination of internal complexity within countries and this growing interdependence between countries leads to what Schmitter calls,
Wait, let me guess. Complex interdependence.
you got it.
Okay.
And this complex interdependence has huge implications for how we study politics.
Because it means the old way of looking for simple cause and effect relationships between single variables
Mm-hmm.
just doesn't work anymore.
Exactly. If a country's economy tanks, it might not be just because of their own policies, but a whole host of intertwined factors, including global economic trends or decisions made by other countries.
It's like a giant game of Jenga.
Mm-hmm.
You pull out one piece and the whole structure starts to wobble.
That's a great way to put it. And this interconnectedness challenges us to think differently about how we compare political systems and how we understand power dynamics in the world.
So how does Schmitter think comparative politics should adapt to this complex interdependence? What are the practical implications?
Well, one major shift, he suggests, is to rethink our basic unit of analysis.
What do you mean?
Traditionally, we focused on sovereign national states as our main unit of comparison.
Right, because countries have traditionally been seen as the primary actors on the world stage.
Exactly. But as we've been discussing, that idea of sovereignty is becoming more and more blurred. Countries are increasingly constrained by international agreements, regional bodies, and those global trends we talked about. It's like countries are sharing a house with a bunch of roommates and they can't just do whatever they want anymore.
They have to consider the needs and desires
Yes.
of the others. I like that analogy.
It captures the reality of our interconnected world. So Schmitter argues that instead of just looking at states, we need to start thinking about polities.
Polities. Okay, now I'm a little lost. What exactly are polities?
He defines polities as broader entities that may or may not be states, but that exercise political power. Think of regional organizations like the European Union, or even powerful non-state actors like multinational corporations or indigenous groups with self-governance.
So it's about recognizing that power isn't always neatly contained within the borders of a country. It's about looking for those centers of political authority wherever they may exist.
Precisely. And this raises a really important question. If we're moving beyond states as our main unit of analysis, how do we actually go about comparing these more complex polities? What's the new playbook?
That is a great question, but unfortunately we're out of time for this part of the deep dive. Don't worry though, we'll tackle that question and more when we come back for part 2. Welcome back to the deep dive. Last time we left off with a pretty big question. If we're moving beyond comparing countries as our main unit of analysis, how do we actually study these more complex polities in a world of, this complex interdependence?
Right. It's a great question, and Schmitter offers some insightful guidance. He argues that we need to shift our focus from looking at single variables in isolation to understanding how multiple variables interact and create these patterns.
Yeah, okay.
Instead of asking what's the impact of X on Y,
Right.
we should be asking how do X, Y, and Z along with a host of other factors work together to shape political outcomes in this specific context.
Okay, so instead of looking for simple cause and effect, it's more about understanding the complex interplay of various factors.
Exactly.
Can you give me a concrete example? I'm someone who always finds those helpful.
Absolutely. Imagine we're trying to understand why some countries have higher levels of public spending than others.
Okay.
The traditional approach might focus on single variables like individual preferences for social welfare programs or the strength of labor unions.
Those seem like logical factors to consider.
They are, but Schmitter argues that this approach is too limited. To truly understand public spending, we need to consider the bigger picture. What's the country's electoral system like? How are its political parties structured? What's its history of social movements? All of these factors interact in complex ways to shape that final outcome.
So it's not just about adding up individual preferences or looking at these isolated factors.
Mm,
It's about understanding that web of relationships, the historical and institutional context that influences decision-making.
exactly. And this leads Schmitter to another important point, the need to embrace what he calls fuzzy concepts.
Fuzzy concepts. That sounds intriguing. What does he mean by that?
Well, think about some of the most important concepts in political science. Democracy, governance, legitimacy.
Right.
These are all complex ideas open to interpretation and debate.
Yeah, you're right. There are so many different types of democracies,
Hmm.
different ways to govern. There isn't like a single universally agreed upon definition for any of these.
Precisely. And trying to force these concepts into neat, easily measurable boxes might actually make it harder to understand the nuances of how they work in the real world.
So Schmitter's saying it's okay to acknowledge the fuzziness, to accept that some concepts are inherently complex and can't be easily categorized or measured.
Right. Embracing those gray areas can actually lead to a richer and more realistic understanding of how political systems work.
This is making a lot of sense. But how do we actually study these fuzzy concepts? If we can't easily define them or measure them, how do we make meaningful comparisons?
That's the challenge, and it requires developing new methods and approaches. We need to look for patterns and relationships, consider multiple perspectives, and be comfortable with ambiguity. It's about looking at the whole picture, not just isolated data points.
That's a great point. One of those fuzzy concepts you mentioned earlier was governance, which is a term we hear a lot these days.
Mhm.
Can you unpack that a bit? What does Schmitter actually mean by governance, and how does it differ from traditional government?
That's a crucial distinction to make. When Schmitter talks about governance, he's referring to a more horizontal, collaborative way of making decisions. It's not just about the traditional top-down authority of government.
So instead of the government dictating everything, it's more about different actors kind of working together, finding common ground.
Exactly. Governance involves multiple actors, public and private, national and international, coming together to address collective problems. Think of it like a community meeting where everyone has a voice and can contribute to the decision-making process.
That's a helpful analogy. And it sounds like governance goes beyond just the government. What about the role of markets?
That's another important point. Governance is distinct from market mechanisms as well. It's not about letting the invisible hand of the market decide everything. It's about finding a balance between state intervention market forces and this more collaborative, participatory approach.
So it's like a three-legged stool:
Yeah.
government, markets, and governance. Each one plays a role.
Hmm.
And you kind of need all three for a stable and functioning system.
Exactly. And to illustrate how governance actually works in practice, Schmitter highlights two key examples: multi-level governance and polycentric governance.
Okay, break those down for me. What do those terms mean?
Multi-level governance is about decision-making happening across different levels: local, regional, national, and even international. Think about the European Union policies are shaped by interactions and negotiations between all of these different levels.
So it's like a system of nested dolls, with each level having its own sphere of influence, but also interconnected with the others.
Exactly. And then there's polycentric governance.
Yeah.
This is about authority being dispersed among different agencies and organizations rather than concentrated in a single institution.
So instead of one central command center,
Right.
you have multiple centers of power,
Hmm.
each with its own expertise and responsibility.
You got it.
Think about environmental policy. You might have different agencies responsible for air quality, water quality, waste management. They all work independently, but also have to coordinate their efforts to address complex, interconnected environmental problems.
It sounds like a more decentralized and flexible way of governing,
Hmm.
and maybe a more effective way to actually tackle those complex challenges we were talking about earlier.
That's the idea. Schmitter argues that these forms of governance are becoming more common even in countries that may be resistant to globalization in other ways.
That's interesting. So even
Yeah.
if a country tries to isolate itself, it's still having to adapt to this more complex and interconnected way of doing things internally. It seems that way, and it highlights the reality of our globalized world. Those interconnections can't be ignored. The way we govern ourselves has to change along with it. This brings us to one final concept that Schmitter highlights: equifinality.
Equifinality. Now, there's a word I haven't heard before. What does that mean?
Equifinality is the idea that different paths can lead to similar outcomes. It challenges that traditional comparative politics focus on explaining differences between countries.
So instead of asking why countries are different, we're asking why they might end up in the same place, even if they took different routes to get there.
Precisely. And Schmitter draws on examples from his own work on European integration and democratization. Countries with very different histories, cultures, and political systems have somehow managed to converge on similar outcomes, a unified Europe democratic institutions.
It's kind of like baking a cake. You
Yeah.
can use different ingredients, different ovens, even different recipes,
Yeah.
but still end up with something delicious.
Right. Equifinality reminds us that there isn't a single blueprint for success or failure in politics. There are multiple pathways, multiple ways to achieve similar goals.
So comparative politics isn't just about finding the one right answer or the one perfect model. It's about understanding the diversity of experiences and the different ways in which political systems can evolve and adapt.
Exactly. And it highlights the importance of studying those different paths, understanding the context, and recognizing the complexity of political change.
This deep dive is really making me rethink how I view the world. But it looks like we're running out of time again for this part.
Yes, but don't worry, we'll bring all of this together in part 3 and explore what it all means for you, our listener.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've spent the last 2 parts exploring Philippe Schmitter's ideas about, this changing landscape of comparative politics.
Right.
We've talked about complex interdependence, those fuzzy concepts, and the shift from studying states to polities. But now for the big question. So what?
Mm-hmm.
Why should all of this matter to our listener?
That's the key, isn't it? Making these abstract ideas relevant to everyday life. Schmitter's call for complexification isn't just an academic exercise.
Right.
It has real implications for how we understand and engage with the world around us.
So can you give us an example of how this plays out in the real world? How does this idea of complex interdependence actually affect people in their daily lives?
Sure, let's take climate change as an example.
Okay.
It's a global problem
Mm-hmm.
that requires global solutions. One country's emissions affect everyone else,
Right.
and finding solutions requires cooperation between governments, businesses, and individuals on a massive scale.
Wow.
That's complex interdependence in action.
Yeah, that's a really powerful example. It highlights how understanding these patterns of interconnectedness can help us grapple with some of the biggest challenges we face
Mm-hmm.
as a global society.
Absolutely.
Hmm.
And it's not just about understanding the problems, though. It's also about understanding how solutions emerge. Who are the key actors? Where does power lie? How are decisions made in this complex web of actors and interests?
So Schmitter's call for complexification is about more than just recognizing that the world is complex. It's also a call to action,
Mm-hmm.
a challenge to think differently about how we approach these challenges.
Absolutely. It's a challenge for political scientists to develop new tools and concepts that can capture this complex reality. But it's also a challenge for all of us to think more critically about the world, to be more aware of the interconnections and unintended consequences that shape our lives.
This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive.
Yes.
As we wrap up, is there one final thought, one question that we can leave our listener with?
How about this? How does complex interdependence play out in your life, in your community? Think about the decisions that are made, the policies that are implemented, the problems that you face. Where does power actually lie? Who are the key players?
And how can understanding these patterns of interaction help us navigate the complexities of a globalized world? That's a fantastic question to leave our listeners pondering. It's a reminder that we're all part of this intricate web, and understanding those connections is crucial for building a more just and sustainable future. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of comparative politics. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.